According to Islamic traditions, the third Caliph Uthman collated the Quran and distributed it to the then major centers of Islam. It is this collection of the Quran that Muslims claim has been preserved till modern times. The putting together of the Quran in one volume by Uthman came to be known as the Mus'haf of Uthman. That is to say, the Quran that Uthman collected and standardized. In Islam, the honest truth, it is explained that there is no historical or manuscriptal evidence that Uthman undertook such a unification task. Even if the Islamic narrative is granted, he was not successful in this endeavor. But just to go along with the traditional Islamic narrative, in part 1, it was explained when it came to the collection of the Quran by Uthman, he burnt other versions of the Quran, an action that was met with resistance, indignation and protest. Nor did he have the authority to carry out such a task, because he was not one of the 4 whom Muhammad praised for knowing the Quran the best. However, for someone who is claimed to be so instrumental in the compilation of the Quran, it is important to know who Uthman was from an Islamic point of view. As Islam is divided along sectarian lines, Sunni Islamic sources will be cited in this video who form the majority and are most favourable to the person of Uthman. When Uthman came to power after Umar in 644 AD, he was elected from a 6-man committee that included himself. This committee was chosen by Umar on his deathbed, and the successor was expected to rule according to their predecessors, namely Abu Bakr and Umar. Ali was rejected for appointment at the committee because he stated he would rule according to the rule of Allah and Muhammad and not of his predecessors. Upon this answer, Uthman was selected as the next caliph. Further reading can be done in Hazrat Ali Murtada by Professor Masood al-Hassan, of which the link is below. Uthman went a long way, not only in his religious views, but also socio-politically, even more than his predecessors, until it started to affect the political and religious life of the community, eventually leading to a revolution. At the time, there were still those who believed that Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, should have been the first and next caliph, thus regarding Uthman as a usurper, just as they did with Abu Bakr and Umar before him. Uthman, like his predecessors, was guilty of nepotism, misuse of public treasury, corruption, double-dealing, and turning the empire over to Muhammad's old enemies, the Bani Umayyads. Uthman, the so-called compiler of the Quran, was a hated figure. Many Muslims still held resentment towards him for pleading to Muhammad on behalf of his relative Abdullah ibn Sa'd ibn Abi Sarh to be spared when Abdullah had apostated by becoming a non-Muslim during Muhammad's time. The Muslim historian Ibn Ishaq says on page 174, a person of the Ansar had taken a vow to kill Ibn Abi Sarh if he saw him. Uthman, whose foster brother he, Ibn Abi Sarh, was, came and interceded for him with the Prophet. The Ansari was waiting for the signal of the Prophet to kill him. Uthman interceded and he let him go. The Apostle of Allah said to the Ansari, "Why did you not fulfill your vow?" He said, "O Apostle of Allah, I had my hand on the hilt of the sword waiting for your signal to kill him." The Prophet said signalling would have been a breach of faith, saying, "It does not behove the Prophet to make a signal." Another example of his nepotism was when he appointed notorious people from amongst his kindred at key positions. Uthman appointed Al-Walid ibn Uqba, one of his relatives, as the governor of Kufa after dismissing the previous governor, the famous companion of Muhammad, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, who was a very early convert to Islam and loyal to Muhammad. Sa'ad built the city of Kufa under Umar's reign and is credited with introducing Islam to China in 650 AD. He was a leadership rival to Uthman as one of the 6 people nominated by Umar for the caliphate, which Uthman eventually became. The behavior of Al-Walid during the time of Muhammad was not honorable, and the Quran in chapter 49 verse 6 discredits him, as Allah declares him as a transgressor, fasiq. This is because Al-Walid had lied to Muhammad. As a result, the following revelation came down. O you who believe, if a wicked person, fasiq, comes to you with any news, ascertain the truth, lest they harm people unwittingly, and afterwards become full of repentance for what ye have done. Tafsir Ibn Abbas explains the verse in the following way. This verse was revealed about Walid ibn Uqba bin Mayt, who was sent by the Prophet to Bani al-Mustaliq to collect their arms. Instead, he came back claiming that they wanted to kill him. The Prophet and his companions were about to set forth to conquer them, but Allah forbade them from doing so, saying, O you who believe in Muhammad and the Quran, if a hypocrite, Al-Walid ibn Uqba, brings you news about Bani Mustaliq, check whether the news is true or false. When Al-Walid was appointed governor of Kufa by Uthman, his transgressions continued. Once he led the morning prayers in a condition of intoxication. This incident is mentioned in countless sources including Sahih al-Bukhari, also in At-Tabari chapter The Crisis of the Early Caliphate, volume 15, page 120. Uthman was reluctant to punish Al-Walid. It was only after public pressure did he acquiesce. For example, Sahih al-Bukhari 3872, it says in the relevant section, what prevents you from speaking to your uncle Uthman regarding his brother Al-Walid bin Uqba? The people were speaking against the latter for what he had done. Ubaydullah said, so I kept waiting for Uthman, and when he went out for the prayer, I said to him, I have got something to say to you as a piece of advice. Uthman said, O man, I seek refuge with Allah from you. So I went away. When I finished my prayer, I sat with Al-Miswar and Ibn Abu Yaghuth and talked to both of them of what I had said to Uthman and what he had said to me. They said, you have done your duty. So here a man is trying to advise Uthman that he needs to punish Al-Walid for what he had done, yet Uthman dismisses his advice. The lengthy hadith goes on to explain, eventually and only after much public pressure does Uthman punish his relative Al-Walid. Uthman further said, what are these talks which are reaching me from you? As for what you have mentioned about Al-Walid ibn Uqba, Allah willing, I shall give him the punishment justly. Then Uthman ordered that Al-Walid be flogged 40 lashes. He ordered Ali to flog him, and he himself flogged him as well. Similar to his predecessors, Uthman fled from battles or did not attend them at all. This is a major sin in Islam. Quran chapter 8 verses 15 to 16 says about the destiny of those who flee from the battlefields. O believers, when you face the disbelievers in battle, never turn your backs to them, and whoever does so on such an occasion, unless it is a maneuver or to join their own troops, they will earn the anger of Allah, and their abode will be hell. What an evil destination. According to An-Nasai 3671, Muhammad said, fleeing from battle is one of the 7 major sins that doom a person to hell. Quote, he said, fleeing on the day of the march, meaning battlefield. Sahih al-Bukhari 4066 confirms Uthman fled from battles on more than one occasion. In the relevant section it says, Do you know that Uthman bin Affan fled on the day of Uhud? Ibn Umar said, Yes. He said, Do you know that he, i.e. Uthman, was absent from the Badr battle and did not join it? Ibn Umar said, Yes. He said, Do you know that he failed to be present at the Ridwan Pledge of Allegiance, i.e. the Pledge of Allegiance at Hudaybiyah, and did not witness it? Ibn Umar replied, Yes. Although the hadith later goes on to justify his fleeing and being absent, and says that he was conveniently forgiven for his actions, the point remains, he did indeed flee from battles, whereas the Quran and hadith condemns it in the strongest possible way. Islam's own history shows that many early Muslims and companions of Muhammad considered Uthman as not only an unreliable person, not fit to be a caliph, therefore definitely not be able to undertake such an important task of compiling the Quran. Many considered him as a non-believer to the point he was eventually killed by Muslims. For example, prominent Muslims and close companions of Muhammad, such as Talha ibn Ubaidullah and Zubair, were some of the main agitators against Uthman who plotted his murder. They were not the only collaborators against Uthman, as Sunni history says that Talha's cousin, Aisha, Muhammad's wife, also collaborated and campaigned against Uthman. In one of the earliest sources of Islamic history, At-Tabari, volume 15, page 238 to 239, it explains that once Aisha went to Uthman and asked for her share of inheritance from Muhammad a few years after his death. Uthman refrained to give Aisha any money by reminding her that she was one of those who testified and encouraged Abu Bakr, her father, to refrain paying the share of inheritance to Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad. Uthman argued, if Fatima does not have any share of inheritance, then why should she? Aisha became extremely angry at Uthman and came out of the meeting saying, Kill this old fool, for he is an unbeliever. Many other Sunni sources document this incident referenced in Islam, the Honest Truth. Documented in Tarikh al-Yaqubi, volume 2, page 175 to 176, in the year 656 AD, on the day of Uthman's assassination, the people who were said to have been directly involved in the assassination of Uthman were Muslims, no less by the companions of Muhammad called Sahabas. The names of them were Muhammad ibn Abu Bakr, Muhammad ibn Hazf, ibn Hazm, Kanani ibn Bashar, Umar ibn Hamq Khazai, Abdurrahman ibn Udais al-Balawi, Sudan ibn Hamran, amongst others. These well-known companions of Muhammad besieged Uthman in his house and prevented him from having a drink of water, so that they could force him to resign. When Uthman refused, they eventually entered his room and struck blows at his head whilst he was reading the Quran. Naila, Uthman's wife, threw herself on his body to protect him and raised her hand to deflect a sword. She had her fingers chopped off and was pushed to one side. The next blow killed Uthman, and then they tried to decapitate his body, but his wives Naila and al-Banin threw themselves across the corpse, screaming, beating their faces and tearing at their clothing. This action had the desired effect, as it deterred the murderers, so instead they looted the house, snatching at the women's veils as they left. At-Tabari, volume 2, page 702, mentions that the killers of Uthman comprised of two groups, one led by Abdullah ibn Saba, who claimed that the successor after Muhammad should have been Ali. The second category comprised largely of Bedouins among the Arabs, many of whom turned against Abu Bakr and his allies, namely Umar and Uthman. Note that all these groups who had a hand in the assassination of Uthman all considered themselves as Muslims. As a long-time rival and now the next Caliph, Ali, was accused of having a hand in the assassination, although he acquits himself from having taken any part. Aisha and Talha turn Uthman's assassination as a pretext for instigating the people against Ali and then going to war with him, claiming he was reluctant to bring the murderers to account and how he benefited most from Uthman's death by becoming the next caliph. This was the same Aisha who had previously led a group calling for Uthman's death publicly. On other occasions, Ali reckons Muawiyah to be the guilty one, the same Muawiyah who will also go on to use Uthman's assassination as a pretext for plotting and disrupting the legitimacy of the caliphate of Ali, eventually going to war with him. After Uthman's death, the humiliation did not stop. His beard was pulled out of his face and his body was left to rot for days. For example, in Al-Majma' al-Zawaid, Volume 9, page 95, the prominent companion Malik ibn Anas says, quote, "When Uthman was killed, his body was thrown in garbage after 3 days." End quote. The Muslims were so resentful of Uthman that they did not even deem him to be worthy of being given a decent burial. When it eventually came to the burial of Uthman, Muslims resisted that he be buried with other Muslims in the cemetery called Al-Baqi. Instead, he was buried in a Jewish abandoned land where the call of nature was answered and rubbish was dumped. Others say it was a Jewish graveyard. Nonetheless, Uthman was buried in a place called Hash, also pronounced Hush Kaukab. And Nawawi records in Al-Majmu' Volume 3, page 154, quote, "Hush is a place where they answer the call of nature. It is also called toilet." End quote. His corpse was not washed, given ceremony, or shrouded. It was put into the ground at night, with only a handful of his family present. Stones were thrown at his corpse and at his burial. It was only years later, after Muawiyah seized power, he bought Hashkaukab from the Jews and included the area into the Muslim Al-Baqi cemetery. So the conclusion, Muslims believe Uthman to be the one who compiled the Quran. Uthman was appointed caliph because he said he will rule according to his predecessors and not by the rule of Allah and Muhammad, as Ali had stated. Uthman pleaded for his non-Muslim cousin Ibn Sarh when Muhammad wanted him dead. Uthman was considered corrupt and condemned for nepotism, hoarding of wealth and extravagant spending. He was also targeted for some of his religious practices, such as fleeing from battle. Uthman dismissed a loyal companion of Muhammad called Ibn Waqas and appoints his sinful relative instead, Al-Walid ibn Uqba, who the Quran condemns. Uthman was accused as being a non-Muslim by prominent Muslims such as Aisha, Talha and Zubair, amongst many others. Uthman was killed by Muslims and humiliated after his death. He was also refused to be buried with Muslims. Muslims did not attend his funeral. He was given no burial ceremony, with only a handful of his relatives in attendance in the middle of the night.